I'm kind of taking each time I go to conferences, I'm always a lot of times the lone shark in coming into conferences, but I appreciate the support that people give me. A lot of my work is in anarchism and education. And I've edited a book called Anarchist Pedagogy, if you're interested in looking at it. But a lot of people run out of the room as soon as we sort of hear that word, because they go, oh gosh, this is the property destroyer, the sort of utopian concepts of how we're going to change the world and those things. And really, it's not surprising that it's seldom discussed in academic settings. But however, David Graeber talks about these sort of fragments where anarchism is actually occurring, and especially in his role in anthropology, you're starting to see more folks in geography and international relations, as well as political science, that anarchists, people that are studying anarchism and looking at some of those different theoretical frameworks are emerging. Additionally, we find researching those sorts of things, but for the most part, anarchism is looked upon as what Suiza points out: at worst, violent, and best, naive. Let's face it on that. And part of the reason to opposing attitudes towards anarchism in the academy is that most have very little knowledge about it. I mean, asking my family or my students about Emma Goldman, and or even I think about Eduardo Galeano's work in talking about forgetting, when he talks about forgetting about the Haymarket situation in 1886. So where we don't even know what that is, right? Especially in the United States. David Graeber also argues that most academics seem to have only the vaguest idea of what anarchism is about, or dismiss it with the crudest stereotypes. I seem to agree with Graeber, since I get the occasional snicker, the patronizing smile when discussing my research with others. In fact, I had to hide it at one of the universities because my professor said I was anti-patriotic. In many cases, I'm not surprised by these responses. And again, I want to kind of point that out in this discussion, because I think when we talk about anarchism, I think there's some really interesting points that people are bringing up historically. So we talked a little bit before in the other session about history. I want to focus on really two people, Emma Goldman and Valterine de Cleyre, who were both anarchist feminists, and I think wrote two really interesting pieces on anarchism and education, and really critiquing education in the early 20th century and how we can learn from them today. So as an anarchist educator, in which you can talk about my contradictions, but we all are walking ones, right? I gravitate towards the philosophical and political dynamics of anarchism, and that I find it refreshing that anarchist theory contains a component of self-reflection and self-critique. And really what Uri Gordon describes, and I think this is kind of interesting, an imperfect and present tense experiment in alternative social relations. So it's what we're doing in here and now. And also this sort of fluidity of anarchism is have questions from people too as well. The sort of dynamic and not universally defined aspect. I was just watching an Al Jazeera news show just recently, and they're all trying to define, well, here's a guy in Argentina, here's a guy over, in the UK, and here's other people trying to define what anarchism is. And the thing is they all have their different perspectives. They all put their sort of ideas in. And I'm not going to go into the theoretical frameworks and the philosophical ideas of someone, but we can talk about that in a discussion over some drinks. But I want to really focus on really the beginnings of this and how we can kind of think about schools in general. Because a lot of us come here in terms of like wanting to support public schools. And again, I'm from an anarchist point, I do support our teachers, and I was a public school teacher as well in the past. And the thing is, what I want to kind of do is revisit even some of the Marxist sort of perspective on it, because I think it gives us some insights into really how we understand the relationship between public education and the notions of capitalism, and specifically the next stage of it, neoliberalism. Right? So really what we see in like 1976, so I would go back to the sort of correspondence theory, Bowles and Gintas. They wrote a book in 1976 called Schooling in Capitalist America. Maybe some of you have read it. But really they look at the social education aspect. They said basically that they say here the social relationships of education normally correspond to the social relationships of production in capitalist society. The labor process in terms of internal to schooling itself It's carried out by the education workers and fundamentally conditioned by the relationship of production in the larger economy. I think John Foster, or Bellamy Foster, wrote a piece just recently in the Monthly Review that did a good job of revisiting that discussion. So you have this correspondence theory where education is coinciding, and all of us are talking about this, is basically corresponding with the economic development of capitalism. And so I want to make sure that we understand that it doesn't just happen overnight. I mean, in the United States, for example, Horace Mann, who's quote unquote our founding father of public education in the United States, was part of this project to really develop and educate workers, right? Make sure that they're obedient. And as Michael Kott said, who wrote a book on pre-industrial capitalism in the United States, he said the crusade for educational reform led by Horace Mann was not the simple, ambiguous good it had long taken it to be. The central aim of the movement was to establish more efficient mechanisms of control, and its chief legacy was the principle that education was something the better part of the community did unto others to make them orderly, moral, and tractable, right? And that was in the 70s, right? He wrote this, and then, of course, Horace Mann was in the 1840s. To go further, we start looking at even if you even do a little bit of research into really what in the early 20th century, in terms of the sort of development of sort of highfalutin sort of industrial capitalism movement. The superintendent in New York describes this sort of education process as the state provides experts who supervise the teachers, suggests the processes that are most economical, the task system obtains in the school as well as the shop, right, connecting it to the shop. Each grade being measured quantity of work to be accomplished in a given term, right? We see that in our own work now. You need to get through these sort of modules on your online course, right? I did at Monash University when I was in Australia. I had 175 students in one course, right? So the efficiency model was there. We saw how quantity was, in terms of, we used to have bets on how many discussion board postings we could have on Blackboard, and I won. I think I got 3,500 in one semester. So free drinks, so it was good. So when we look at historically, and these are just two examples of them, of really the connections between, and some people mentioned about scientific management and Taylorism. Anarchists understood this at the time. Anarchists understood, especially Emma Goldman and Baltringue and Claire, if you read some of their work, you can begin to understand how their criticism is important for us today. So Emma Goldman, basically, if you're not familiar with her, was an anarchist feminist. She basically, as Ferguson points out, Goldman articulated an uncompromising radical vision of a just, free, and joyful society. Remember that, joyful, right? I want to enjoy my life, as well. It doesn't need to be something rigid, doing jumping jacks or something like that in the state. Furthermore, I agree with Ferguson in that, in many cases, Goldman is seen for her activism and not her political theories. So I think, but a lot of times her work is overshadowed by the dominant sort of monopoly cows. If you looked at some of our textbooks, they usually have, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, and Emma Goldman's not even on the list, right? She's on a sidebar. But thousands and thousands of workers were coming here to speak during the early 20th century. So she wrote a piece, and from an educational standpoint, a lot of her work and Baltringue's work stemmed from Francisco Ferrer, who basically was an anarchist in Spain. He was executed because of trumped-up charges saying that he was a violent person. In fact, he wasn't. They ended up finding out that he wasn't the person that they thought he was, but he was contesting the church, really, and some of the fascist things that was going on there. He developed, and he wrote this book called The Origins of the Modern School in Spain, and he contested, of course, dogmatic thinking, particularly authoritarian religious thought. So when he got killed, Emma Goldman and Baltringue and Claire started writing and going actually on speaking engagements, really talking about how his work and his educational processes are important. So anarchists believe that, as much as you want to say it's an oxymoron, that they believe in education. They believe in this particular, it's still not out there. What type of education? Again, I asked the question before, do we want to make the road by walking, or do we want some concrete thing? And I would say they're more towards the make the road by walking aspect, but we can talk about that further. And really by 1906, 1906, Emma Goldman wrote this piece called "The Child and Its Enemies," and she basically says, she basically said the systems of education are being arranged into files, classified and numbered, and are incapable of waking the spontaneity of character. And she saw it as like schools and education process are just basically developing facts and data, or mining that. And I think over 100 years ago, she was actually looking at exactly what we're talking about here. So it's not new, right? It's not new. It just comes in different forms. So I'm going to keep going just quickly, because I don't have a lot of time. Valtraine de Cleyre, on the other hand, is sort of an unknown anarchist feminist. She died at an early age of 45. She wrote this piece called "The Modern Educational Reform," and she really looks at, and that was 1909. That's right before she died. And she basically says, that education is based on this sort of secondary motive. One of her main points is the secondary motive. And what she says is that the statesman is part of the secondary motive. And she said here, the statement says she describes is not interested in the actual work of schools, in the children as persons, but in the producing of a certain type of character to serve certain subsequent ends. So when we think about the neoliberal agenda, this is exactly what we can kind of consider her ideas in terms of the statesman, right? It's these outcomes, what type of citizen, what type of people are we trying to create in this? And of course, Foster later on in contemporary times talks about this idea that schools are then less about education and more about behavior modification, right? To basically go out there and go to the degraded job and the work environment we have and the crappy sort of positions that that we're forced into, right? So I'm going to quickly go into, well, why anarchism, right? We have to understand that schools, and particularly state-run schools, are unhealthy places to be. I mean, I have my kids in public schools because I believe and I trust. I mean, I really want to work to struggle for those spaces, even as an anarchist. But it's not surprising that, from an anarchist standpoint, that these places are not healthy. There's deep connections between the public schools, the state, and their economic sort of relationships under neoliberal global capitalism. The classrooms that are oversaturated with de-skilled teachers and basically using standardized curriculum and market-driven forces. No Child Left Behind, we had a little discussion about that before. But these market forces and economic shifts can be seen as an example, really, towards that. And I've got other things to talk about, but I kind of want to sum this up here because I think I only have a couple minutes. From a contemporary perspective, new educational landscapes that challenge these dominant neoliberal practices are being constructed throughout the world. The spontaneity that Goldman advocated for can be seen in different spaces. According to Day, there are no totalizing or universal systems. He's pulling from Deleuze there, but I think it's really important that we understand that this is not a totalizing effect, right? There's resistance that is, there's new subjectivities that we're grinding away at in the system. Meaningful educational practices are taking place in the streets of Argentina, the libraries and the democratic practices within the Occupy movement, in the free schools in Minneapolis, the People's University in Washington Square, the Work People's College, the IWD, I just saw a sign up here for that. Even the direct action organization Chicago Teachers are actually asked anarchists to come in and talk about how we do direct action, right? And then also the anarchists who have put publicly were supported by Brazilian teachers who got, put themselves on the front line getting shot with rubber bullets by cops while they're protecting teachers. So I understand that at times someone consider these to be fragments. I understand that unimportant, under-theorized, or even naively developed educational experiments, right? But this is where I believe anarchism has its most intriguing potential for us to begin to create educational spaces within the ruins that the neoliberal project was leaving us. And maybe this is another reason why anarchism is not viewed sort of favorably in the academic sort of rings, is that people are always asking, where's the blueprint, Rob? Where's the blueprint? And David Graeber argued in a recent article in the BAF where he said, listen, we've never had a society that's based upon blueprints. I mean, yeah, we've had some sort of concept of it, but really there's never been, neoliberalism, I mean, Marx had some idea about it, but not he didn't have a whole and deep understanding. So when we start thinking about these things, you really have to think about these things in two ways, and I mentioned this before in the question before. Do we want to look at the road by walking, meaning zapatismo, right? Or do we ask the question about Chavismo, that we want more concrete developments into creating a sort of post-capitalist society? And Peter McLaren, who came to our conference keynote a couple of years ago, said this: we need both. Right? And my thing is, from a non-sectarian aspect, I want to work towards it. Right? I want to develop it. So with that said, I'll stop it there. Thank you.